You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Welcome to this episode of Reclaim Catholic. This is Jacob Nelson, your host. I am so very excited to continue doing this podcast. I hope that many people listen to it, not because I want to have fame. In fact, I was telling my wife that's actually one of the things that has stopped me from doing any kind of podcasting in the past. I've always liked to be in the background. I don't like to have people's eyes or ears upon me. However, having been asked from a number of people to do something like this, and with positive feedback from my first brief episode, I'm so very excited to be doing this. In this episode, we're going to take a look at a few things. We're going to continue our look at Code Apostolici Mineris by Pope Leo XIII, and we're going to take a look at some things regarding the natural law and Saul Alinsky. As I mentioned in the first podcast, it's not enough to just not be a communist. It's been abundantly clear from our popes from various era that one, ultimately, if they're going to be a faithful Catholic, has to be an anti-communist. We have to fight communism wherever we see it, wherever we find it, because communism, as a zeitgeist of our age, is atheistic. It seeks to destroy the church. And it's so important, and that's why I wanted to start this podcast with the notion of reclaim, and that's our title for this podcast series. Reclaim what? Reclaim being Catholic. Reclaim all that our amazing faith has given to us. And not just us, but to the whole world. The church has invented so many things and has sought to help man in every arena. And yet, so much of what she does has been stolen, has been corrupted, has been abused. I mentioned in the last episode, and we'll dig into it, we'll dedicate at least a few episodes to the notion of social justice. But the reality is social justice is a term that the church invented so that man would have some kind of process or idea of how to engage society in a just way, hence the term social justice. And yet that term, when we hear it, if one is a faithful Catholic, believes in tradition, they hear that and they tend to shudder. But we shouldn't shudder. We should take that and we should reclaim it for what it is, a just way for man to, with a Christ-like love, engage society. So it's so important that we recover all that the faith has to give us. So as I mentioned in this episode, we're going to aim to reclaim a few things. We're going to start with this document from the great Pope Leo XIII. We pick up where we left off when he writes, "They leave nothing untouched," they meaning the communist. And by the way, Pope Leo XIII was not the only one who spoke of communism and socialism, but he was one of the great leaders in this reality that one cannot be a communist and socialist and be a Catholic. You must pick one ideology or the true faith, for that matter. But he goes on to say, "The communist leaves nothing untouched or whole, which by both human and divine laws has been wisely decreed for the health and beauty of life. They refuse obedience to the higher powers, to whom, according to the admonition of the apostle," that is Paul, "every soul ought to be subject, and who derive the right of governing from God, and they proclaim the absolute equality of all men in rights and duties." So first of all, before I continue on with this, when he talks about the right to govern from God, does not mean a divine right that a particular person was chosen and so they lay claim to the throne, but that the ability to govern comes from God because he is the great governor. He's the great governor of all of creation. He's the great legislature of all natural and divine laws. And so the ability to govern is, in fact, a reflection upon God, a reflection of God to society. The ability to legislate, to create laws and enforce them, is also a reflection of God in society. And we'll get to this in a little bit, but this is exactly why actually so many people hate the natural law, because every law presupposes a lawgiver. So that's first. Secondly, again, to repeat from last week, the communists, proclaim the absolute equality of all men in rights and duties. And there is a sort of absolute equality in all men and women, in case anybody wants to hash out that I wasn't being inclusive of women. But all men and women have an absolute equality in terms of what's known as equanimity, or an equality of proportion. This, again, is a review from last week, and that's fine. We need to get these notions into our head as much as possible. But the equality of proportion is that, say you have a 12-ounce glass and a 30-ounce glass, and they're both full. Well, they have equality in that they are fulfilled. They do not have equality, strictly speaking, in every last ounce and every last drop of water. But one can't hold 30 ounces. And so it would be ridiculous to try and force 30 ounces into a 12-ounce glass. Likewise, it would be ridiculous to put 12 ounces in the 30-ounce glass and say it's full. And so we cannot confuse equality of proportion, equanimity, and equality of mathematics, or strict equality. And in fact, that's what the communist tries to do. Tries to say that all things are absolutely equal, and anything that has any difference needs to be addressed. When in fact, Christianity, Catholicism, we highlight, we honor differences in one another. If you really dig into the philosophy of this, it's important to note that the only perfect thing there could possibly be, whether you are a Christian or not, but the notion of perfection is God. Perfection, that if anything changes, it becomes not perfect. That is completely and utterly fulfilled no matter what. And so for somebody to proclaim some kind of ultimate perfection of equality is ultimately to worship those things that you're seeking to make strictly and utterly equal in perfection. Because the communist doesn't have a God, at least not a real one. Their God is society. Their God is the government. Their God is themselves. And so anywhere where there's a difference, there's not strict equality, but a difference, it highlights the fact that there's not a strict equality or a perfect equality in every possible way. So you can begin to see where they're actually worshiping the person, they're worshiping the talents, they're worshiping the government, they're worshiping whatever it is except God himself. This is one of the reasons why you can't be a Catholic and a communist. Okay? So going on, Pope Leo writes, they debase the natural union of man and woman, which is held sacred even among barbarous peoples. And to that, I take a little bit of offense to Pope Leo here. A barbarous person, a barbarian, is one who is bearded. That's what the word barber means, and I'm bearded virtually every day of my life, 99% of the time. So, I'm a little offended there. Well, not really, because I'm not a progressive. But anyway, even among barbarous people, even among the barbarians, the natural union of man and woman is held sacred. And its bond by which the family is chiefly held together, they weaken or even deliver up to lust. Anybody story hours at libraries with some, let's just say, funnily dressed people who are living some kind of delusion or confusion? They want to debase what is natural. They want to debase that which is good, true, and beautiful. Now, to highlight this, I had to do a little bit of digging because the Black Lives Matter organization has gone in and they have changed their what we believe section on their website. In fact, they completely took it out. Because once Black Lives Matter started getting a lot of attention paid to it, one of the critiques of Black Lives Matter was, in fact, what they believe. Before I get into what they believe, I'll give the addendum here that people can change. People can change beliefs. Even organizations can change their missions and their belief systems. But what typically doesn't happen is an international organization completely changing the modus operandi of what they believe. It's not usually the case. So instead of really changing it, they simply took it all out. So luckily I saved it. I have it. You can find it online still, because once on the internet, it is forever. So you can look for the archive. But on their What We Believe section, they go into some pretty interesting things. But for the sake of taking on political power, they write, let me find it. We work vigorously for freedom and justice for black people and, by extension, all people, which itself is a little bit odd because they juxtapose black and white all the time. And I'm a firm believer that all peoples are equal in dignity and all peoples deserve freedom and an ability, an equality of opportunity, not necessarily an equality of outcome. That's an important distinction as well, but an equality of opportunity. But blacks and whites are so often juxtaposed by this organization. You can't say that freedom and justice for one group of people is then freedom and justice for every group of people. It doesn't work that way. But I agree that we need to work vigorously for freedom and justice for all people. But the interesting thing is the way that they go about that. Let me find it again. I lost my highlights on here. So here it is. It's under my staple, of course. I tell you. All right. So they write, we are self-reflexive and do the work required to dismantle cisgendered privilege and uplift black trans folk, especially black trans women who continue to be disproportionately impacted by trans antagonistic values. We make our spaces family friendly and enable parents to fully participate with their children, which is great. But the next line is a little odd as we start digging into this. We dismantle the patriarchal practice that requires mothers to work double shifts so that they can mother in private even as they participate in public justice work. We'll get into maybe another history opportunity in the future, but the patriarchal practice that requires mothers to work, in fact, is not patriarchal at all. It's actually due to the breakdown of the quote-unquote patriarchy or the abolition of the father that has required mothers to do double shifts. So I agree, moms shouldn't have to do double shifts and then mother in private. I agree with that, but it's a false premise. The dismantling of the patriarchal practice would only further mothers to have to work more. You know, let's get rid of the father. Let's get rid of half of the parenting. And then all of a sudden the one parent who's left can have more time to just mother? That makes no sense. We shouldn't just take word salads and assume that they are, in fact, true. It goes on to write, we disrupted the Western prescribed nuclear family structure requirement by supporting each other as extended families and villages that collectively care for one another, especially our children, to the degree that mothers, parents, and children are comfortable. Again, the aim to break down the nuclear family structure, and it says the Western prescribed nuclear family structure. I'm pretty sure that the idea of the nuclear family, mother, father, children, has not just been in the West. In fact, in the Far East, they have, for a very long period of time, honored the notion of mother and father, and by extension, the grandparents of both sides, far better than the Western world has. This is not a Western societal construct. This is part of the natural law. This is so important that we understand the natural law, which Pope Leo XIII is going to get into. But the reason why I brought up the Black Lives Matter, what we believe section that you'd have to go searching for now is because their aim is exactly what Leo XIII had to say. They debase the natural union of man and woman, which is held sacred even among barbarous peoples, the bearded ones, and its bond by which the family is chiefly held together. They weaken or even deliver up to lust. They weaken or even deliver up to lust. That's through and through this What We Believe section for Black Lives Matter. And we shouldn't be afraid, and I'm going to get into this in a few minutes, why we shouldn't be afraid of people lashing out against us for simply saying Black Lives Matter is an organization that hates Christianity. It hates the West. It hates everything that Catholicism stands for. And at its core, and you can find this too, and I'll find it as well, that the foundresses, said that they are trained Marxists. They are trained Marxists. So they themselves desire Marxism and, in fact, are Marxist agents in our society. We shouldn't be afraid to call this out under the guise that somehow we're racist because we don't believe in an organization that only has the title of Black Lives Matter, when, in fact, we know from study after study after study that it was the destruction of the nuclear family, particularly in the 80s and the early 90s through things like the crime bill that then Senator Joseph Biden pushed so hard for and triumphed with, that it disproportionately affected black families, and it put many fathers into prison and began the breakdown of the family. You can go back in history in the 50s and 60s and even into the 70s. There are a lot of areas in our country where black families earned equal or greater income than a lot of white families. This is an amazing thing to behold. This isn't an issue of black and white, however. This is an issue of communist versus that which is true, good, and beautiful. You can look at Black Lives Matter. You can look at Antifa. You can look at any number of communist organizations, and they're all going to have these same points they make. They want to break down the family. They want to debase morality. They want to infiltrate our institutions. And by doing so, it creates a desire and an openness to more and more government. So it's important we understand this, that there is not a distinction in principle among all of these radical groups that are out there. In the different tentacles they have in our society, they may be different based on which group they try to pander to. But at the core of them all, they are all communistic. Okay? So going on in Pope Leo XIII, let's see, he writes, lured in fine by the greed of present goods, which is the root of all evils, which some coveting have erred from the faith. They assail the right of property sanctioned by natural law, and by a scheme of horrible wickedness that they seem desirous of caring for the needs and satisfying the desires of all men. They strive to seize and hold in common whatever has been acquired, either by title or lawful inheritance, or by labor of brain and hands, or by thrift in one's mode of life. One thing I want to focus on from that is natural law, natural union, marriage, the meaning of our words. Firstly, the good Pope, who is so saintly and such a gift to us, appeals to the natural law. This is not a confusing thing. We can dive deep into it, but we'll just do a brief overview right now. Every nature acts a certain way. Have you wondered why, if you want to go, say, walleye fishing, if you went walleye fishing from lake to lake to lake, from region to region, they all seem to act the same way? You fish for them in a similar manner? Now, did those fish in different lakes or different regions go to walleye school? Of course not. But there is a reason why, in their nature of being a walleye, they act a certain way. That's what we call the law of their nature, or natural law. It's why if we plant acorns and we provide the right environment for them, provide the right light, water, nutrients, and so forth, it'll always grow up to be an oak tree. It's not going to grow up to be a Cadillac or a bag of cash or a house. It's going to be an oak tree. And we know that with a reasonable expectation because of the law that is within its nature. Now, most people don't argue this until we get to the nature of man. And we say, well, man is called by his nature to be good, to be moral, to be holy. And we can get into all of the why of that coming up in some future episodes. We're going to look at the construction of the human person, body and soul, not just the 5 senses man has, but the 9 senses he has. Bet you didn't know that one. But we're going to get into that. But his nature is called by law to be good, moral, and holy. Well, if there's a law that governs man's nature, then we have to admit there's a lawgiver. And that's where people start to go off the rails. They don't want this great God in the sky that they contrive of to dictate to them how they're going to act. But the problem with that is that God is the one who made us. He wrote the law. He knows what's best for us. And so if one admits the natural law, they have a duty to understand how that God, our God, the God of all that is true, good, and beautiful, is calling us to live. Because he wants what's best for us. That's why he put a law in us in the first place. The universe is not chaos. It might feel like it right now. But the universe is not chaotic. It is good and it is rightly ordered. And to that end then, rightly ordered, the gift of man and woman in marriage. Did you know that the word marriage comes from an Old English word, but it literally means to make a mother? So all this talk about marriage between same sexes, it's foolish. You could argue if you wanted about civil unions. I think that would be a good show to do as well, because civil unions are not for the good of society, but that's for a different topic. For now, the idea of marriage, we can't let people co-opt the term marriage. And we shouldn't even co-opt it or allow it to be corrupted by saying, well, marriage is between one man and one woman. That's what I believe. No, marriage is marriage. And yes, it is between one man and one woman, but we shouldn't have to qualify it. And so if somebody challenges you and you say marriage and they challenge you about the meaning of it, you say, yeah, it's between one man and one woman and it's not up for discussion. The word literally means to make a mother. Okay? One of the things we need to understand about Catholicism, everything has a purpose and a meaning. The point of marriage, to make a mother, it's for the unity of the spouses and the procreation of children. Those are the 2 goods of marriage that must always be kept in the forefront of our minds. And the word marriage signifies that. To make a mother. Mother, of course, signifying the rearing of children. To make, well, it takes a man and a woman to make, okay? And the will of God to infuse the soul. But to make a mother, it implies the unitive and the procreative ends. Okay, that's what we need to understand about Catholicism. Everything has a purpose, everything has a meaning. For a communist, the only purpose is communism. And nothing has meaning, because they can change language however they want to achieve their ends. We see them do it all the time in our culture. Don't succumb to using the language of the communist. They'll constantly push their own definition of words until you either use them as they want or use them how you want but qualify them. So if you're having a discussion about marriage and you have to start qualifying it in your own mind, it's one thing to define it for somebody else. It's another thing that if you start qualifying it in your own mind so that you don't feel like you're being a bigot, that's a problem, because there's nothing bigoted about defending the truth. Okay? They're going to try and force you to use words the way they want you to use them. We see this all the time of the idea of a transgender person and a trans man or a trans woman. No, they are a man or a woman. I don't even know how you clarify all of the crazy going on out there with gender theory. You can't give in to their desire to change language, Don't do it. Don't give an inch. Be confident in the language of the church, in the language of reality. It is not a purely societal construct, things like marriage or language. Yes, different cultures have different languages, then that's fine. But if you go in any culture and look at the nature of marriage, it's always between a man and a woman. And for the record, gender has nothing to do with sex. Gender is something to do with language, gendered language. It's why in the Romantic languages you change words to match the gender of who's speaking or the gender of the noun. Sex has to do with the person. Okay, so they've already moved the goalpost so much, we need to recover that. We need to reclaim that. Language ultimately extrapolates what's in nature so that our mind can comprehend it. It's why when we look at an oak tree, we label it an oak tree and not an aspen tree, so that when we see the acorn, we already know what it's for because our language describes it for us. It describes what's implicit in it, and then we can begin to comprehend it, and we can share that knowledge with one another. Language is something that doesn't define nature. No, language is something that describes it. Okay? Saul Alinsky understood this and pushed for it. In his book, Rules for Radicals, and he's got a few other books, he goes through the importance of using our ideals against us. He goes through the power of language and needing to recover language or bend language to one's own purpose. For the Catholic, we need to recover language and defend it for the truth it represents. I'm not going to go through all of his rules right now in Rules for Radicals, but a couple I just want to touch on. The fourth rule, he writes, make the enemy live up to their own book of rules. You can kill them with this, for they can no more obey their own rules than the Christian church can live up to Christianity. And you see this happen all the time. If you go on Twitter, you go on Instagram, you watch TikTok, you watch YouTube, you're out in society, you see it all the time. Well, is that what Jesus would want you to do? Really? Do you know Jesus better than I do, communist? I mean, come on. This is something we need to get better at as Catholics. Not to be ashamed of our faith, and not to be ashamed of the fact that we utilize the gift of confession. It's okay to make mistakes. God knows we're going to make mistakes. We shouldn't allow some commie to hold our mistakes against us. We have the gift of confession, so don't allow them to use our own ideals against us. In fact, own your ideals and be humble enough to say, yeah, I need to get better in that, but that still doesn't make the communist worldview right. The fourth rule carries within it the fifth rule. Ridicule is man's most potent weapon. It is almost impossible to counterattack ridicule. Also, it infuriates the opposition who then react to your advantage. I believe Satan's name is the Great Accuser. And in fact, Saul Alinsky honors Satan at the beginning of this book as the first radical. So it shouldn't surprise us that he says ridicule is man's most potent weapon. Notice he doesn't say pointing out one's legitimate faults. He says ridicule. You can ridicule somebody for anything you want. And as soon as you do, it puts them on the defensive. They start retreating. That's why this is such a powerful rule for Saul Alinsky. But there's one more powerful thing than this in terms of potency of weapons, and that's charity. That's love. That's to take on the abuse of somebody in terms of our cultural dialogue right now and choose to love them in response. And part of that love is not to simply give in or simply put up with their errors. And it's also not to roll over and be a doormat. Sometimes love, have you ever heard the term tough love? Yeah. So sometimes with love, we have to call people out for the errors they're making. I mean, how many communists, socialists, progressives do you know house homeless people in their own home? How many of them own a car? Are they living up to their ideals? I don't think so. But it's not a matter of ridiculing them. It's a matter of calling them to task to say, if you really believe in your ideology so much, then maybe you need to do more. Because I, as a Catholic, I love my worldview. I love the church. I love Jesus Christ. I love the Blessed Mother. And I love them so much that I'm going to go and seek forgiveness from them for when I don't live up to the ideal. But hey, you communist, when you don't live up to the ideal of communism, who do you apologize to? Who do you seek mercy from? Because the last time I checked in communism, let's see, there was something like 100 to 150 million dead innocent people in the 20th century, all related to communism. I don't think there's much room for mercy there. The sixth rule, a good tactic, is one that your people enjoy. If your people are not having a ball doing it, there's something very wrong with the tactic. And that's something that I hope will come across in this show. That this is something I enjoy. I'm not doing it for money. I'm not doing it for fame and notoriety. I'm doing it because I love the truth, I love the church, and I love our country enough to, whatever limited talent I have, to offer it for the sake of defending the good of America, the good of our nation, of the United States of America, against the evils of communism. We're going to get in, running out of time, but we're going to get into next time the 8 steps to communism. And I'll just rattle them off quick. The Saul Alinsky highlights 8 different areas to control in order to move a nation to communism. Healthcare, poverty, debt, gun control, welfare, education, religion, and class warfare. We're going to dig into that deeply next time. That'll be kind of the only thing that we do on the next episode. So you don't want to miss it, the 8 steps to communism. But the thing I want to implore you to at the end of this episode is to know your ideals and live up to them. But do not let the communists hold your failure against you. You are not seeking the ideals for the sake of the communist. You are seeking the ideals for God's sake. The communist cannot save you. Only Christ can. You don't need to confess your sins to some commie who hates you anyway. You have confession. They don't. You have mercy. They don't. Why doesn't the communist live up to their own ideals? Again, are they housing homeless people? Do they divide their income amongst everybody in their neighborhood? Do they own a car? Do they step down from their job so somebody that can check the right boxes in society can have their job? No, they never do this. Let's maybe try to get on offense a little bit here. Let's reclaim the proper order of things. Only God can save. All we can do is be humble before Him and pray for our enemies. And yes, every communist, everybody who espouses the religion of communism, this is not a political structure. This is a religion that demands your worship. Every communist is, in fact, an enemy to the church. Let us pray. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Please subscribe and follow this podcast, both on Apple Podcast and on Patreon. Again, this is always free. There's an option on Patreon to offer a donation to upgrade equipment and just support the efforts of this, but it is always free and it will always be free. Again, Apple Podcast and Patreon, Reclaim Catholic. God bless you. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.